The pie in the sky when you die by and by. That's the big hope of heaven, isn't it? That's the atheists say it's just a whole lot of wishful thinking. You're just hoping, that's what you just, and it keeps the masses working, says what's his name, Marx, one of the Marx brothers. No, what the atheists have said that this is just a whole, we've just all made up. Years ago, I was actually a member of the Melbourne Skeptics Society. It's a group of mostly atheists. They get together, and I went along to a couple of their meetings, and I had to resign from the Skeptics Society, not because I wasn't sceptical about a lot of things they were sceptical of, but because it was just this great Skeptic Society. It was just 8 grumpy old men complaining about everything. I had to resign just to get away from the whinging. It was killing me. This little tiny group, atheists. In 2018, the World Atheist Convention was planned here in Melbourne with Richard Dawkins as the keynote speaker. It was cancelled for lack of interest. Now, what's going on? People love what Richard Dawkins says. When he puts down religion, when he thrashes Christianity, people love to hate religion. They love to put down your faith and pie in the sky when you die by and by. They love to do that, and yet they're not buying into the atheist, the full atheist view. Why is that? Well, the answer is because we're still here. Where did we come from? Even the hardened unbeliever who hates your religion most of them will still say, well, yeah, there has to be some sort of higher power. Intellectual absurdity to believe that we just popped out of nothing. Even our children can get this. Children, where did the world come from? Where did we come from? How did we get here? How did that happen? God? Yeah? God put us here, right? Of course. God put us here. And God has to be someone who is eternal, who's always been there, who didn't come from anywhere, where otherwise we couldn't explain where we came from. Without God, even most unbelievers can get that. But if we can't deny that there must be something out there powerful enough to create this world, and whoever that God is who's put us here, we also can't deny that something has gone terribly wrong, and this world is a mess. Now, of course, the atheists use that to say, well, that proves that God doesn't exist. Well, no, that doesn't make God disappear. It just only proves that God has chosen to allow it, and that leaves us with 2 options. Either God, who is powerful enough to create this world, has the power to do something about the evil and suffering and horrible way this world is, and he's chosen to not do anything about it because he can't or doesn't want to, or he is going to do something about it, and it's going to have to be sometime in the future. That is, there'd have to be a heaven or a hell, or both, to clean up the mess of this world. Now, how could you know any of that was really true for sure? The only way you could really know whether any of that is really true is if God showed up in person and told us. Well, we've been tracking through some 13 chapters of John's Gospel. And right from the beginning, John has introduced us to who Jesus is, the Word who is God, who became flesh. And then as we've worked our way through John's Gospel, frequently Jesus has alluded to, or indirectly or directly said that he is that God who showed up in person, inside of history. And even the hint here in our opening verse, and it's only a hint, where Jesus says in chapter 14, verse 1, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me." So do you notice there he's connecting trust in God with trust in himself? Again, that connection of Jesus and God. And yet, of course, we're not going to use that text as our great proof that Jesus claimed to be God. But he does it far more explicitly, even in this very chapter. We won't get there today, but later in this very chapter, he's going to tell the disciples, take a look here. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father, you've seen God. So he's going to get far more explicit, even in this very chapter, as he has during this gospel. And we've looked in this gospel at not just Jesus making these claims, but we've looked at reasons why people have rejected Jesus. And the primary way that people have rejected Jesus has not had anything to do with the evidence. They were there, they saw miracles, they saw everything, and yet they still rejected him. It was an issue of the heart. They did not want to submit to Jesus' authority, even in spite of the evidence. So all of the great questions in life that are supposedly unanswerable, the great questions of, is there an afterlife? Is there a heaven? Is there a hell? How do we know what the meaning of life is? All of those things, the answer to all those questions are wrapped up in one question that John has been posing to us by providing the historical evidence, and it's the question of who is Jesus? Because if the Pharisees are right, Jesus is just a deceiver or a madman. But if Jesus is who he says he is, then we have answers as to whether there is an afterlife, whether there's a heaven or a hell or any of these other sorts of things. Why? Because God showed up in person and told us, if you can trust Jesus. And he says in this very text, trust in me. But if God is going to clean up the mess of this world sometime in the future, who of us has enough pride to say, well, if that day comes, I haven't done anything wrong. I've never told a lie. I've never had a bad thought or a bad word. In other words, if this same God is going to clean up the mess of this world, he won't just stop with the terrorists or the murderers or the rapists. He'll go all the way down to the very thoughts and words of your own heart. That means we're all in trouble. We're all headed for a great... This world is a disaster. This world is a mess, but we're headed for an even bigger disaster. A disaster called the judgment, where every deed is brought into judgment. Now, I don't know whether any of you have ever... there are kids' movies out there, but for us who are older, there's even movies that go way back with movies with time machines. Remember that Time Machine, Rod Taylor? Or there's been a lot more modern movies that I haven't seen. I know they deal with this issue, Back to the Future, all that sort of stuff. The idea is if you could get in a time machine, you could go back into time and rewrite history a little bit to avoid the disaster that's going to come or the bad thing you want to avoid in the future. Well, Jesus has a time machine. He is the eternal God himself, And he travelled into time 2,000 years ago to avoid the disaster that was coming on you and me. To go to that cross, to take that judgment, the penalty for everything that we've ever done wrong, if you will but have faith in him, that will avoid that future disaster that you're headed for otherwise. How do we know this is going to happen? How do we know there's such a place as heaven or hell? It all rests on this question of Jesus saying, trust in me. Now, the biggest challenge for us as Christians today in trying to reach the unbelievers is not to try and convince them that heaven exists. They already believe heaven exists. Most of them, apart from those 8 grumpy old men in that skeptic society, the rest of the world believe that's our problem. They all believe in heaven and they think they're all going there. So how are you going to respond? Here's your evangelism tip for the day. What do you say? Because they'll tell you, the celebrity funeral, oh yes, they're up there playing rock and roll in heaven, or they're, everybody's up there smiling down upon us, aren't they? It's the old, how do you get through to that? How do you get through? When everyone believes in heaven, they all think they're going there. Well, here's the evangelism tip for the day. You've got to ask them this one question. Where did you get the idea there's such a place as heaven? Where'd you get the idea from? And I go, well, everybody believes in heaven. Everybody believes in it. You know, where did you get the idea? It sounds like a good idea for a book here. Where did you get the idea there's a heaven? And they'll go, well, look, all the religions, everyone thinks that there's a heaven. And we're going to say, well, no, all the religions don't believe that there's a heaven. When we think of heaven, when the Westerner thinks of heaven, someone up there smiling down upon us, we're thinking of a personal, ongoing existence. The real person themselves is up there smiling down upon us. But the Eastern religions do not believe in heaven in that sense. They believe in an afterlife. But, you take Buddhism, for example, nirvana. People think, oh, well, that's heaven. No, it's not. Nirvana means extinction. The whole goal in Buddhism is to extinguish the self so that when I finally get out of this ugly reincarnation thing and finally get to nirvana, I'm not me anymore. There's no such thing as the self anymore. They don't believe in heaven. Hinduism, similar. Being yoked with Brahman, free from the individual, and so on. Now, Islam believes the Quran speaks about heaven, though it's very, doctored from the biblical heaven, and yet it says there's a heaven. But where did the Quran, where did Muhammad, where would he say the idea of heaven comes from? Well, the Quran many times over claims to be a follow-on from the Bible, from the teaching of Jesus, from the Old Testament and the teaching of Jesus. So the Quran, Muhammad, the founder of Islam, would say the idea of heaven comes from Jesus and the teaching of the Bible. So when you cut through all this whole business about, we all believe in heaven, where does it actually come from when someone talks about, they're up there smiling down? Where do you get that idea? And the answer is, whether you've thought it through or not, you got the idea from Jesus. And then you've got to say to your friends, well, if you got the idea from Jesus, whether you've thought about it or not, wouldn't it be a good idea to check with the owner of the joint before you presume you got your room booked? Think about this. A motel owner, in my motel there are many rooms. Yeah, I've got one of them. I'm going to be staying in your motel. Oh, that's good. When did you book? What's your name? Where's your booking? Oh, no, I didn't speak to anybody at the motel. Then why would you think you've got a room booked here? Speak to the owner. Speak to the owner. Now, that's the majority of people, that they already believe in heaven. They've just never thought through where it comes from, where the idea comes from. What about those people? And they are in the minority, and I think it's just those 8 grumpy old men. But there are people who say, no, there's no such place as heaven. When you're dead, you're dead. That's it. There's nothing. And there are a lot of people who think that. They still might think there's a higher power created things. But no, when you're dead, you're dead. Heaven's just something that people want to believe. It's fanciful. Well, hang on, what's more fanciful? If you think about it, that most people can't deny there's some higher power that must have created this world, powerful enough to design this world, powerful enough to create this world, and also we admit that this power has seen that there's something gone terribly wrong and thinks something's gone terribly wrong, but, I've got no other plan, that's it. I think that's more fanciful if we want to talk in just pure speculation. But when we think more practically, God created this world. People might want to say it in those terms, but ultimately they're admitting it when they say there must be a higher power. Right? And we were created in God's image, and human beings create. And we create things that are beyond the imagination of a previous generation. If you'd have told me 40 years ago I'd be even using a computer, let alone being able to type a little letter and send it to the other side of the world without leaving my office, without even putting it in the envelope, and even more, even being able to see someone's face and talk to them on the other side of the world. I was talking to Anga, who's back in Indonesia, by the way, and talking to him face to face over the other side of the world. You go, that's nuts, that's the Jetsons, that's not real, don't give me that. Or if you said to someone 120 years ago, listen, you see that big steam train there? It's going to pretty soon, we'll have something as heavy as that, put a few hundred people on, whack a couple of big heavy wings on it that can't flap, and that big heavy steam train will fly up into the air. Yeah, right. But it happened. We create things beyond each generation, beyond our imagination. Is it so amazing that God could create a place, as he says here in verse 2, in my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I'm going there to prepare a place for you. He's going to prepare. He's going to create. He's going to have it there. Is it really so beyond our imaginations that the Creator who created this world could also do that? Now, we're not told what the rooms are like when he says there are many rooms, but I know when we start talking about heaven, people think of, floating around on a cloud, trying to learn how to play the harp forever, and just sort of boring. And, a bit of a consolation prize, look, after we're dead, at least there's something else, like as though this is the real life. That doesn't seem to be what the Bible speaks about. It seems that the Bible is more clearly saying that this is the broken place. This is not the way life was meant to be. You caused it to be like this through your sin. So the first thing we need to note is just looking at what Jesus just said there, that in my Father's house are many rooms. Heaven is some sort of physical realm. It's not some floaty, cloudy experience. Jesus, if it was anything different, Jesus would have told us. If it were not like this, I would have told you, he says. Jesus ascended into heaven in the sight of his apostles, in his body. So wherever heaven is and whatever dimension heaven is, Jesus is there in a physical body now. Now, yes, his physical body, as we saw it after his resurrection, seemed to have qualities beyond this. It seemed like he could walk through walls and all that sort of stuff. Different dimension, yes. And yet, such a continuity with this life that he sat down and ate fish with his disciples. So heaven will be a lot of feasting. We're told, Revelation 19:9, we eat and drink at the marriage supper. We know that music is a prominent feature of heaven. We see the heaven scenes in Revelation where there's lots of music going on. People's, the things that they've done good end up becoming part of this new place. Revelation 14:13, their works will follow them. Now, what does that mean? We know we're not saved by those works, so what does it mean? Something in the sense that anything good done and anything that is good. Read with me Revelation 21:24. The nations will walk by its light. This is heaven he's speaking about. And the kings of the earth will bring their splendour into it. Now, what does that mean? Bring their splendour into it. Well, I know we could speculate on different things it means, but anything that's done for the splendour and glory of God in this life will have continuity. Whether it's arts or music or things done that are good for the glory of God, everything that's done that's bad or self-centered, that's not for the glory of God, will be burned up, but there'll be continuity of that which is good from this life. Not a lesser life, but far greater. And the main thing, of course, is worshipping. Now, that's the other thing that people talk about, worshipping. Boy, that's going to be pretty boring after a while, isn't it? Worshipping God. When you really get to know this God, no, the answer is no, worship will not be boring. But also, just as this earth, Romans 12:1 and 2 tells us that our whole life is an act of worship, so too, the new heaven and new earth, our whole life. Just like now we'd have times of corporate worship, there will also a whole activity, everything done to the glory of God will be worship. Remember when Jesus was transformed at the transfiguration and Moses and Elijah and the disciples saw them, that's the heavenly state. They were actually looking, they were on their faces seeing Jesus, Moses and Elijah in this heavenly state, this glorified state. So it's really something that's supernatural, and yet at the same time, it was so natural in that Jesus was speaking with Moses, having a conversation with Moses and Elijah, even planning what was up ahead, the cross at that stage. So heaven is going to be a place where there's communication, speaking, laughter. Those who mourn will laugh. It's going to be a reunion. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 talks about the reuniting with those who have gone on. Think of someone that you know that's gone on to heaven. You're going to meet them again. You're going to talk with them. You're going to communicate. It's going to be a glorious reunion. And even children who died in infancy. Remember the story of King David when his infant son had died and his servants were bamboozled why he was no longer worried after the child had died. He said, "Don't have to worry, I'll go to be with him. He won't return to me. Some have even speculated that children that do die in infancy grow up in heaven. That could be true. We don't know how all that works. But one thing we do know is unbroken fellowship, joy, feasting. Jesus has gone ahead to prepare a place for you in this. We don't have all the details, but we have this promise from God in Ephesians 2 verse 7, in order that in the coming ages he might show the incomparable riches of his grace expressed in his kindness to us in Christ Jesus. So the richness of his grace is incomparable. It's going to be expressed to us in the coming ages, in this time, in this new experience where Jesus has gone to prepare a place for you. Paul, the apostle, got a glimpse into heaven and he wasn't even allowed to tell. It was so amazing. But he also said in 1 Corinthians 2 verse 9, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him. But God has revealed it to us by his Spirit. He's given us a snippet by his Spirit and his word to let us know there is something. Just like we don't know exactly how heaven's going to look and feel and all those sort of things, and yet we know this much. Jesus said to you, I've gone there to prepare a place for you. We know that much. Now, where does this whole idea, we don't see a lot of heaven mentioned in the Old Testament. It's there. You know, Elijah went up to heaven. There are definitely places we can see it, but it's not a big feature like the New Testament. And yet the promises were there in the seed form. Look at where we read from before. Before we look at that, again in Genesis chapter 3 verse 15. Remember, God pronounced the judgment, and in that promise he said that one said to the serpent that one born of the woman will come and crush your head. Now that, of course, was the promise of the Christ to come, who would overturn the work of the devil and indeed crush and defeat the devil. And that means the Christ has to come and reverse the work of the devil, which was sin, reverse the effects of sin. Therefore, he would have to reverse, instead of death, eternal life. Instead of corruption and corrupt bodies, a new resurrected body. Instead of a corrupt earth, a new earth. Indeed, a new heaven and new earth. 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 13. But in keeping with his promise, we're looking forward to a new heaven and new earth, the home of righteousness. Now, when Peter said that, in the original Greek language, there are two common words used for the word new. And one of them means new in the sense of completely new, like new in origin, so completely new. And the other one means new in quality. And it's the second of those two words that Peter uses when he says there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. What's the point of that? The point is that it's going to be, yes, the old earth is going to be burned up with fire, but it's also going to be completely purified and renovated to become so fantastically new that it has to be called a new earth, and yet it has its origin in the old. Why is that important? It's important because if God threw away the old earth and created a completely new one, threw away our bodies and gave us completely new bodies, Satan wins. Satan can say, hey, I destroyed your creation, I brought sin in, and you lose because you had to throw it away and start again. But God wins. even out of the dust of our rotted bodies. He's going to create, just like he created us out of the dust the first time, that same dust, he will create us again. Recreate us. Resurrect us. So notice the word resurrection is not thrown away in something new. No, resurrected of the old body. God wins. The work of the serpent is crushed with the new heaven and new earth and the resurrection of our bodies. And the promise was there in the life of Israel. As I said, heaven's not mentioned often in the Old Testament. But what was the promised land? Why were they looking forward to this promised land? Well, ultimately, it's pointing forwards, isn't it? The promised land, the land of Canaan, where Eden will be restored. The new heaven and new earth, where Eden will be restored. In actual fact, Ezekiel 36 verse 35, the land of Canaan is actually likened to the Garden of Eden. So there's this little hint that Canaan is a much bigger promise than the Israelites even imagine, and yet it was there for them if they look carefully. Even the very first promise to Abraham, Genesis 17 verse 8, we read it earlier, and this is the connection. The whole land of Canaan, this is God's promise to Abraham, the whole land of Canaan where you are now an alien, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I'll be their God. Now, hang on a minute. How is the land of Canaan an everlasting possession? Unless it's part of the new heaven and new earth that will be forever. The promise was there from the fall and the expulsion from Eden, where God has promised to reverse that work, crushing the work of the serpent, and then it widens. You notice that? We've got the Garden of Eden, but expulsion from Eden, but then God says, no, look for the promised land of Canaan. And then on into the New Testament, it's widening to look at the new heaven and new earth. And so you've got this promise widening further and further. So yes, Canaan will still be in that new earth, but it's the whole world that the Israelites are promised. And it was there, in the Old Testament. Jesus even widened the promise. Remember when Jesus said in the Beatitudes, he said, the meek will inherit the earth, right? But he's quoting from Psalm 37. Psalm 37 says the meek will inherit Canaan, the land. So here's Jesus expanding, showing us that this whole idea of Canaan, of this promise, is expanding and expanding. And Abraham knew it. He knew that it wasn't just Canaan he was going to inherit. Have a look at Romans 4 verse 13. It was not through law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he, Abraham, would be heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. The promise of Canaan was ultimately a promise you're going to get not just Canaan, you'll get that. You're going to get the whole world. Christ came to save the whole world. So if there's going to be a new heaven and new earth, how does that connect? Where does the connection between these two? Well, we need to read Revelation 21, verses 1 to 4. Then I saw a new heaven and new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. So there we see that the new Jerusalem is the bride of Christ. That's the people who've gone on to heaven. They're with God, right? So the people of God who have gone on to be with God are there with God, but what happens then? They, with God, come down to meet earth. In this new heaven and new earth, there's going to be, well, read on with me. Verse 3, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. So what have we got? We've got the people in heaven waiting, but at the day of judgment, the resurrection, when everything's renewed, and we've got our new resurrected bodies, heaven is going to come down to earth. We'll be back here again, but it's going to be renewed. So renewed, it's got to be called a new earth, including the land of Canaan, the whole thing. Satan did not win and outsmart God, and he had to throw it all away. Back here to Eden again, in fullness. God wins. That's heaven. No more tears, no more crying, no more aches and pains, no more death or mourning, no more funerals, no more goodbyes, no more struggling in temptation, just everlasting joy, fellowship with one another. But of course I've been holding back the main feature of heaven, and it's in our text today. The whole thing, the whole point of heaven and the new heaven and new earth being together is that God is there. You'll be with God. That is the real point of heaven. And that comes out of our text of Jesus saying, I'm going to prepare a place for you, and I will be with you. You will be with me. That's the feature of heaven. What absolute craziness if you think you can ignore God in this life and expect to go to heaven, because God will be there. Didn't want to know God in this life, but expect I'm going to heaven. Should have checked with the owner of the joint before you presume you had a room booked. You know, next time people say to you they think they're going to heaven, you've got to say to them, you know, you tried hijacking the idea of heaven. You got it off Jesus and now you want it for yourself, like you made it up yourself. You ignore the one who gave you the whole idea of heaven and you expect to go there. And then on top of that, you want to hijack the way to get there by saying, I just got to be a good person. I got to sort of try my best. I'm going to make up my own way. I'm going to take off the owner, the place itself, and now I'm going to make up the way to get there. Should have checked with the owner because he told us how to get there. In fact, it's later in this very chapter, God willing, we'll be looking at it, where Jesus tells us the way to get to heaven. He says, I am the way. Not how good you are. You're so far gone, you need help. So I am the way. I can give you the way through going to the cross, by avoiding the disaster before it happens, entering into time, going through that time machine, entering into time 2,000 years ago to do an eternal work, to take away your sin. I am the way. No one comes to the Father except through me. Well, there's no other way, because if Jesus doesn't take away your sin at the cross, you will face that disaster with your sin still clinging to you and the record of everything you've done, thought and said, and you will get exactly what you asked for, justice, and it ain't going to be a sight. But Do you want that to happen? Do you want to have, the speed camera has already taken the photos. You're caught. Unless you have someone who paid for that disaster in advance for you, paid the fine in advance. And Jesus did that, but he did it for who? For those who are going to be the best Christians, who are going to do the most good stuff? We're too far gone for that. He did it for those who would humble themselves and say, I'm not good enough for heaven. I'm not going to make up my own way to heaven. I'm going to have to go with the owner. There's nothing I can do to wash away the record of my sin. I need to repent and believe in him. And here's the very key to heaven in the words of Jesus in this text. And it's simply this: trust in me. Not trust in yourself. You can't be trusted. Neither can I. Trust in me. That's the key to heaven. Now let me close by asking you this. You've already trusted in Jesus this morning. You already believe. And therefore he has this room secured for you, a place, a future. And he's had that much love for you that he entered into time to avoid that future disaster so that he could prepare this place for you. And he's done all that for you. Then what are you worried about? Anything that's going on in your life now? If he's got that much love for you, hasn't he got everything else covered as well? And doesn't it give you strength to say, I can keep going here. I got someone who didn't just care for me. He even got a real estate already given me for free in the future. Everything covered. All I've got to do is trust in him.